The cold settles before anything else can be noticed. It moves without direction, filling space rather than crossing it, pressing gently into surfaces that do not resist. Wood tightens along its grain. Metal dulls and holds the touch a moment longer than it should. The air carries no scent, only a thin sharpness that lingers at the edge of breath. Sound travels a short distance, then softens, as if absorbed by something unseen. Snow follows in slow, even layers, covering without urgency, smoothing edges that once defined where one thing ended and another began. Nothing asks to be disturbed. Nothing signals that it will change. For now, remain here as the stillness continues to settle, and the shape of waiting begins to form without being named. If this quiet space is one you find yourself returning to, you may take a moment to subscribe, but only if it feels natural to stay a little longer. You're listening to Echoes of War. The ground beneath it is still firm, though that firmness is already being concealed. Each new layer softens the outline of what lies below. Footprints remain for a time, then begin to fade, not erased but absorbed. The difference between where someone has been and where no one has passed becomes smaller with each passing hour. What was once marked becomes suggested, and then slowly forgotten. There are structures here, though they do not present themselves all at once. Their shapes emerge gradually through the snowfall: angled roofs, narrow windows, walls that hold their position without movement. Smoke rises in thin lines, carried upward just enough to be seen before it dissolves into the grey above. The air does not carry far. Sound does not travel easily. Even the smallest noise seems to settle close to where it was made, as if distance itself has grown heavier. Inside these structures, warmth exists in fragments. Not enough to dominate the cold, but enough to interrupt it. Hands hover near sources of heat that cannot be relied upon. Fabric layers against fabric, not to create comfort, but to delay the loss of it. Breath remains visible, even indoors, a reminder that the outside has not been left behind entirely. You notice how still everything feels, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening does not demand attention. There is no urgency in the way the snow falls, no signal that anything must be done about it. It continues regardless of observation, covering what is exposed, softening what is rigid, reducing contrast without resistance. Beyond the structures, the land stretches outward in muted tones. Fields that might once have been open now feel contained, not by barriers, but by the sameness that spreads across them. Trees stand in quiet lines, their branches carrying weight without breaking. Paths exist, though they no longer guide with certainty. Movement through them requires memory more than sight. There are people here, though they are not immediately visible. Their presence is suggested through small disturbances, an imprint in the snow that has not yet faded, a door that closes more carefully than it needs to, a shadow that moves behind a window before disappearing again. Nothing lingers long enough to define itself clearly. Everything is partial, as if the place resists being fully seen at once. The cold does not announce itself as pain at first. It arrives as a narrowing. Sensation becomes selective. Fingers notice less. Faces hold stillness longer than they should. The body begins to conserve without being asked, adjusting quietly to something that does not change. There is no clear moment when it begins. Only a gradual awareness that it has been present for some time. Above, the sky remains low and consistent. It does not open. It does not break. Light passes through it without direction, spreading evenly across everything below. Shadows are faint, almost absent. The world holds its shape, but without emphasis. Nothing stands out more than anything else. Time moves here, though it does not mark itself in obvious ways. There are no sharp transitions between 1 hour and the next. The difference between morning and afternoon exists, but only slightly. The snow continues. The air remains still. The landscape changes without appearing to. You remain at a distance from it, observing rather than entering. There is no single point that demands your attention, no event that defines what this place is becoming. Instead, it unfolds through accumulation of snow, of silence, of small, unremarked adjustments. And beneath all of it, something is closing. Not quickly, not visibly, but steadily enough that what once connected outward is beginning to draw inward, reducing itself without resistance, settling into a shape that is harder to leave than it was to enter. The closing is not marked by a line on a map. It does not appear as a boundary drawn with certainty, nor as a signal that something has been sealed. Instead, it takes shape through absence. The road that once carried movement no longer does. The space that once allowed passage now offers resistance without effort. It is not blocked in any single place. It is diminished everywhere at once. Movement still exists, but it becomes smaller, more deliberate. A figure crossing a field does not walk in a straight line anymore. The path bends slightly, then again, adjusting to ground that no longer responds as expected. Snow shifts under weight in uneven ways. What looks solid yields. What looks open slows the step. Direction remains possible, but it must be remembered rather than followed. Inside the town, the same narrowing continues without announcement. Doors open and close with less frequency. Windows hold their light longer, not out of comfort, but out of necessity. Conversations become shorter, not because there is less to say, but because words no longer travel far enough to matter. The air seems to hold them in place, letting them fall before they can reach beyond the room. There is an awareness here, though it does not speak its name. It exists in the way objects are placed more carefully than before, in the way movements avoid waste, in the way pauses last just a moment longer than they once did. No one declares a change, yet everything begins to reflect one. You notice how attention shifts inward, not in thought alone, but in space. What lies beyond the immediate surroundings becomes harder to picture clearly. Distances lose their meaning when they cannot be crossed. The idea of elsewhere remains, but it feels less defined, as if it belongs to a different condition than the one that now holds steady. Sound continues to fade, though not entirely. A distant report still carries across the fields at times, softened by the air before it arrives. It does not interrupt. It blends into the rhythm that has already formed, subtle, recurring, difficult to separate from the rest of the environment. The difference between natural silence and interrupted silence becomes less distinct. Within this quiet, the body begins to adjust in ways that are not chosen. Hands stay closer to warmth, even when movement would be easier without it. Steps shorten without instruction. Shoulders remain slightly raised, holding a tension that does not fully release. These are not reactions. They are accommodations, formed without intention, repeated until they no longer feel new. The structures that hold the town together, walls, beams, roofs, remain steady, but their purpose shifts. They are no longer just places of rest or work. They become boundaries against something that does not knock before entering. The separation between inside and outside becomes thinner, not in form, but in effect. Cold seeps through. Silence follows it. There is no single moment when it becomes clear that leaving is no longer simple. No announcement. No visible closure. Only a gradual understanding that each attempt outward meets more resistance than the last, until the attempt itself feels unnecessary. The effort does not disappear. It is set aside. You remain where you are, watching without entering. The distance between you and this place holds steady, though what you observe continues to shift within it. Nothing calls for urgency. Nothing asks to be resolved. The scene does not build toward a moment. It settles into one. And as it does, the idea of waiting begins to take form, not as an action, but as a condition that has not yet been named. The shape of what remains. Morning does not arrive all at once. It lifts slowly through the same low sky, not brightening so much as thinning the darkness that held through the night. The snow reflects what little light there is, spreading it evenly across roofs, fences, and the narrow paths between them. Nothing stands in contrast. Edges remain softened, as if the world has chosen not to define itself too clearly. The town holds its position without announcing it. Structures stand where they were before, but their presence feels quieter now, less certain in the way they meet the ground. Windows show a dull, steady glow in some places, already lit before the day has fully formed. In others, there is no light at all, only a pale surface where glass meets the cold. Movement begins in fragments. A door opens with care, not fully, just enough to allow a body to pass through. It closes again without sound, guided rather than pushed. Footsteps follow, measured and close to the ground, each one placed where another has already been. The path is not new. It is remembered, reinforced by repetition rather than visibility. She moves along it without looking down for long. Her attention stays ahead, not because there is something to see, but because there is less uncertainty in continuing forward than in examining each step. The cold meets her before she has gone far. It settles across her face and hands, not sharply, but with a steady pressure that does not fade. You notice how little distance she covers before she stops. Not from hesitation, but from habit. There are points along the way where movement naturally breaks, places where something must be checked, adjusted, or simply endured. A strap is tightened. A glove is pressed more firmly into place. The body pauses, not to rest, but to prepare itself for continuing. Around her, the town remains in quiet alignment with the same pattern. Other figures appear briefly, moving between structures, crossing small sections of open ground before disappearing again. No one lingers. No one calls out. Sound stays close to the body that produces it, fading before it reaches another. There is no visible boundary that defines where the town ends and the open land begins. Instead, the transition occurs through absence. Fewer structures. Wider spaces between them. The snow stretches more evenly, less disturbed. The paths that exist within the town begin to lose their shape as they move outward, dissolving into a surface that holds no clear direction. She does not continue that far. Her movement remains contained, guided by necessity rather than curiosity. What lies beyond is not unknown, but it is no longer part of what must be reached. The range of action has narrowed, not by decision, but by condition. Inside the buildings, a similar pattern unfolds without being seen directly. Hands move across surfaces that have grown colder than they should be. Objects are handled with care, not because they are fragile, but because replacing them is uncertain. Fire is maintained in small, controlled ways, never allowed to grow beyond what can be sustained. Time passes, though it leaves little trace. There are no clear markers of its movement. No sound that signals an hour has ended or another has begun. Instead, time gathers through repetition, the same actions performed again, the same paths walked, the same pauses held in the same places. What changes does so gradually, without drawing attention to itself. You remain at a distance, watching the pattern form without interruption. There is no single point that explains what is happening here. No moment that defines it. Instead, it reveals itself through accumulation, of small movements, of quiet adjustments, of space that is used less and less. And within that narrowing, something begins to take hold. Not visibly, not in a way that can be named yet, but in the way movement slows without stopping, in the way attention turns inward without withdrawing completely, in the way each action feels slightly more deliberate than the one before it. The town does not change its form, but it begins, almost imperceptibly, to change its function. The change does not present itself as a decision. It gathers quietly within the same actions that have already begun, settling into them without altering their appearance. A door still opens. A path is still followed. Hands still reach for the same objects in the same order. But something beneath these movements begins to shift, not in form, but in purpose. Inside one of the structures, the air carries a faint warmth that does not extend far from its source. It rests close to the floor and along the walls, held in place by materials that have learned to retain what little they are given. The space is not large, yet it feels contained beyond its dimensions, as if the cold outside has pressed inward just enough to narrow what remains inside. He sits near the source of heat, though not close enough to depend on it. His posture holds a balance between rest and readiness, neither fully relaxed nor fully engaged. The hands remain visible, turned slightly inward, as if conserving what warmth they have gathered. There is no urgency in the way he moves. Each adjustment occurs slowly, without interruption, as though time itself has lengthened between one motion and the next. You notice how little is wasted, not in the sense of scarcity alone, but in the careful shaping of each action. A piece of fabric is folded, then unfolded, then placed again with slight variation. A tool is lifted, examined without being used, then returned to its place. These are not delays. They are extensions, small ways of holding time in place without letting it pass unnoticed. The room carries sound differently than it once did. It does not echo. It absorbs. Even the smallest movement, a shift in weight, a breath drawn more deeply than before, remains close, settling into the space rather than traveling across it. Voices, when they appear, do not rise. They remain low, shaped by the same restraint that governs everything else. Words are not absent. They are reduced to what is necessary to maintain the rhythm already established. Outside, the same pattern continues, though it is less contained. Figures move across short distances, each following a path that has been repeated enough times to remain visible beneath the fresh layer of snow. The surface gives slightly underfoot, not enough to disrupt movement, but enough to remind the body that the ground is not fixed. Balance is maintained through attention rather than certainty. There is no effort made to extend these movements beyond what is required. No one crosses the open spaces without reason. No one lingers where the cold is uninterrupted. The range of activity holds steady, defined not by visible limits, but by an understanding that does not need to be spoken. What lies beyond remains present, but not engaged. You begin to sense how this understanding shapes the town. It is not enforced. It does not arrive through instruction. It forms through repetition, through the gradual recognition of what can be maintained and what cannot. Each person adjusts without needing to compare their actions to another's. The pattern emerges collectively, but it is carried individually. Time continues to pass, though it offers no clear indication of its movement. The light shifts slightly, not enough to mark a transition, but enough to suggest that something has changed beyond the immediate awareness of those within it. Shadows remain faint. Edges stay soft. The world does not sharpen. It settles. Within this settling, attention turns inward in a more defined way. Not as withdrawal, but as focus. The body becomes the primary reference point. Sensation guides action more than thought. The cold is not considered. It is responded to. The same is true of hunger, of fatigue, of the quiet pressure that builds without naming itself. He rises without haste. The movement is not prompted by anything visible. It follows a rhythm that has already been established, one that does not depend on signals from outside. The space he leaves behind remains unchanged, holding the same quiet arrangement as before. Nothing marks his departure except the slight disturbance in the air that quickly settles back into place. You remain where you are, observing the continuation rather than the change. There is no shift that defines a new phase. No moment that separates what was from what is becoming. Instead, the town holds steady within a narrowing range of motion, each action reinforcing the one before it. And as this pattern continues, the idea of distance begins to alter. Not in how far something is, but in how reachable it feels. What lies beyond the immediate surroundings does not disappear. It becomes less relevant. The effort required to imagine it grows heavier, until the imagination itself begins to conserve energy, focusing only on what remains close. The town does not declare itself isolated. It simply begins to behave as though it is. Roads that no longer lead. The roads are still there. They have not disappeared, nor have they been broken apart in any visible way. Their lines remain beneath the snow, holding the same direction they always have. If uncovered, they would lead where they once led, connecting one place to another without hesitation. But in their current state, they no longer guide. They suggest, and even that suggestion grows weaker with time. Snow gathers differently on the roads than it does on the surrounding ground. It settles more evenly, uninterrupted by the disturbances that mark other areas. Where wheels once pressed into the surface, where repeated movement carved shallow paths, the snow now lies undisturbed. The memory of use remains beneath it, but it does not rise to the surface. Each new layer adds distance between what the road was and what it appears to be now. A vehicle stands at the edge of one of these roads, angled slightly as if it had not been left with intention. Its shape is familiar, though softened by the accumulation around it. Metal holds the cold in a way that cannot be mistaken. The surface reflects little light, absorbing more than it returns. Tracks beneath it have long since faded, leaving no clear indication of how it arrived or why it stopped. He approaches it without expectation. The movement is steady, but not urgent. Each step follows a line that is remembered rather than seen. The ground shifts slightly beneath his weight, the snow compressing just enough to hold the imprint before beginning its slow return to stillness. The distance is short, though it feels longer in the absence of clear markers. You notice how he pauses before reaching it. Not from uncertainty, but from recognition. The object in front of him does not offer what it once did. It remains intact, yet its function has altered. The road beside it no longer supports movement in the same way. The space beyond it does not promise continuation. What was once a point of departure has become a point of return. His hand rests briefly against the surface. There is no attempt to open it, no effort to restore what it was designed to do. The contact is enough. The cold transfers immediately, moving through fabric and into skin, not sharply, but with a firmness that does not fade. He withdraws his hand without hesitation, not as a reaction, but as an understanding. Around him, the road continues in both directions. It narrows as it moves away, not in width, but in clarity. The edges blend into the surrounding ground. What was once defined by contrast now holds no distinction. There is no visible point where the road ends. Only a gradual merging with everything around it. No one uses it to leave. Movement along it exists, but it remains contained within a short range. Figures pass between nearby structures, crossing sections of the road without following it. Their paths intersect it, but do not depend on it. The road is present, but it is no longer necessary. You begin to sense how this changes the shape of the place. Without the road functioning as a connector, each point becomes more complete within itself. The distance between locations is not measured in space alone, but in the effort required to reach them. That effort has grown without being announced. What was once simple now carries weight. The air above the road holds a stillness that feels settled rather than temporary. There is no sign of disruption, no indication that movement will return to it in the way it once did. Even the faint sounds that reach this space, distant, softened, without direction, do not alter its state. They pass over it without effect. He turns before continuing further. Not because there is nothing ahead, but because there is nothing there that must be reached. The decision is not framed as one. It emerges through the same quiet understanding that shapes everything else. The road does not invite continuation. It allows departure, but only in theory. You remain where you are, observing the way direction loses its meaning. Not all at once. Not through absence, but through a gradual reduction in its usefulness. The idea of going somewhere still exists, but it no longer carries the same certainty. It lingers as a possibility, one that becomes less relevant with each passing moment. And within that shift, the sense of connection begins to change. Not severed, not removed, but thinned until it no longer holds the same weight as before. The road continues to exist even after it is no longer used. It holds its place within the landscape, not as a guide, but as a remainder of something that once connected without effort. Snow settles into its shallow depressions, filling what had been worn into the surface by repeated passage. The difference between road and ground becomes less visible, not because the road has vanished, but because it is no longer reinforced. Along its edges, small details begin to lose their purpose. Markers that once indicated direction stand without meaning. Their shapes remain intact, but they no longer direct movement. A post rises from the snow, its surface weathered, its presence unquestioned, yet no longer necessary. It does not point. It does not warn. It simply remains where it was placed, part of a system that no longer functions as it once did. You notice how the space around the road begins to feel larger. Not in distance, but in openness. Without movement passing through it, the road does not define the land around it. It does not organize space. Instead, it becomes another surface among many, its purpose absorbed into the stillness that now surrounds it. What was once structured becomes neutral. A figure appears at a distance, moving toward the road without altering pace. The path he follows does not align with it. It intersects briefly, then continues beyond, unchanged. There is no hesitation as he crosses. No adjustment to follow its direction. His movement remains independent of what the road suggests. It exists within its own narrow range, guided by necessity rather than design. He does not look down. The ground beneath him offers enough resistance to maintain balance, but not enough certainty to allow distraction. Each step is placed through awareness rather than habit. The snow shifts slightly underweight, holding for a moment before settling again. There is no rhythm beyond what the body creates for itself. You begin to understand how direction has been replaced. Not by confusion, but by limitation. Movement no longer extends outward in search of connection. It folds inward, repeating within a defined space that does not expand. The road remains, but it no longer carries intention. It does not lead because nothing requires leading. In the distance, the faint outline of what lies beyond the town remains visible. Not clearly, not in detail, but as a suggestion of continuation. The land stretches outward, uninterrupted, holding the same muted tones that define everything nearby. There is no visible barrier. Nothing stands to prevent passage. And yet, nothing invites it. The absence of movement becomes its own condition. Not a pause, not a delay, but a steady state that holds without expectation of change. The road does not wait to be used. It simply exists in a form that no longer depends on use to justify itself. Its presence becomes passive, integrated into a landscape that no longer relies on connection to define itself. You remain at a distance, watching how this absence settles into place. There is no urgency in the way it unfolds. No signal that something has been lost, even though the loss is present. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance that does not need to be expressed. The road is no longer a question. It is no longer something to consider. It is something that has already been left behind. Without being left. The town does not move away from it. The road does not move away from the town. But the relationship between them changes in a way that cannot be reversed through intention alone. And as that change holds steady, the idea of waiting begins to shift again. Not toward an outcome, but toward something that does not require one. Hours without edges. Time does not announce itself here. It does not arrive in segments, nor does it divide itself into parts that can be easily recognized. There is no clear beginning to the day, no moment that defines its middle, no signal that it is ending. Instead, time settles into the same space as everything else, spreading evenly, without emphasis, without direction. Light remains consistent, though it shifts in ways that are difficult to measure. The sky holds its low, unbroken tone, allowing brightness to pass through without forming shadows strong enough to guide the eye. Surfaces reflect this light softly, offering no contrast sharp enough to suggest that anything has changed. What was visible before remains visible now, but not in a way that distinguishes 1 hour from the next. Inside the structures, the same condition continues. There are no clocks that mark the passage of time with authority. Even where they exist, they are not consulted with urgency. Their presence does not alter the rhythm of the day. Movement occurs without reference to them, guided instead by the body's quiet adjustments and the repetition of necessary actions. She sits near a narrow window, though the view it offers does not change in any noticeable way. Her posture remains steady, not rigid, but held within a limited range of motion. Hands rest against fabric that has already been adjusted more than once. The warmth in the room holds close, never expanding, never fully leaving. Breath remains visible, rising and fading without drawing attention. You notice how she does not look outward for long. Not because there is nothing to see, but because what is seen does not provide new information. The landscape beyond the window remains constant, its details softened, its movement minimal. Observation becomes repetition, and repetition does not require sustained attention. There is a task before her, though it does not define the moment. It is performed slowly, without interruption, not because it demands precision, but because there is no reason to hasten it. Each movement follows the one before it with quiet consistency. When the task ends, There is no clear transition to the next. There is only a pause, not marked by rest, but by the absence of immediate necessity. Outside, figures move through the same narrow range as before. Their paths intersect without acknowledgement, not out of disregard, but because interaction does not alter the pattern. Each movement exists within its own sequence, aligned with the same unspoken rhythm that governs everything else. There is no need to coordinate beyond what has already been established through repetition. The air holds its stillness, allowing sound to settle quickly. A distant noise reaches the edge of perception, then fades before it can be placed. It does not interrupt. It becomes part of the background, indistinguishable from the quiet that surrounds it. Nothing demands a response. Nothing shifts the pattern already in place. You begin to sense how time is no longer measured through change. Instead, it is held through continuity. What persists becomes the only marker. What repeats becomes the only reference. The absence of variation does not slow time. It removes the need to recognize it as passing. She rises, though there is no visible reason for the movement at that moment. The action follows a pattern that has been repeated enough times to exist without explanation. Her body adjusts, not in response to a signal, but in alignment with a rhythm that does not depend on external cues. The space she leaves remains unchanged, holding the same quiet arrangement as before. You remain where you are, observing without interruption. There is no shift that signals progression. No moment that suggests that something has advanced. Instead, the day continues as it began, without defining itself, without offering a clear sense of where it stands. And within that continuity, something begins to settle more deeply. Not a change in the environment. Not a new condition. But a growing distance between the awareness of time and the experience of it. The hours do not separate from one another. They continue without edges, blending into a single stretch that holds its shape without dividing itself. What might once have been marked as morning or afternoon no longer carries a clear distinction. The difference remains in a distant sense, but it does not influence how the day is lived. Instead, the body moves through it as though it were one continuous moment, extended without interruption. Inside the room, the same arrangement persists. Objects remain where they were placed, not because they have been fixed, but because there is no reason to move them. Each item holds its position within a quiet order that has formed without instruction. When something is touched, it is returned carefully, not out of habit alone, but out of an awareness that its place contributes to the stability of the space. He stands near the doorway, though he does not leave immediately. His posture suggests readiness, but not urgency. One hand rests lightly against the frame, feeling the surface rather than relying on it. The air that moves through the small opening carries the same cold as before, unchanged, consistent. It does not invite departure. It simply confirms what lies beyond. You notice how he remains there longer than the action requires. The pause is not hesitation. It is a holding of the moment, a way of allowing time to exist without advancing it. There is no visible thought guiding this stillness. It emerges from the same rhythm that governs everything else, a quiet extension of the pattern already in place. When he steps outside, the transition is immediate. The cold does not arrive in stages. It meets him fully, pressing against exposed skin, settling into fabric, moving inward without resistance. His body responds without delay, not through reaction, but through adjustment. Shoulders tighten slightly. Steps shorten. Breath steadies. The space outside offers no new direction. The same paths remain, lightly marked beneath the fresh layer of snow. They do not change in form, only in clarity. What was visible becomes suggested. What was suggested becomes assumed. Movement follows these paths not because they are seen, but because they are known. Figures cross at intervals, each moving within a narrow range that does not expand. There is no attempt to extend beyond it. No visible effort to alter the pattern. The repetition holds steady, reinforced through use, not intention. Each action supports the next, creating a continuity that does not require acknowledgement. You begin to understand how this continuity reshapes the experience of time. Without clear markers, without variation strong enough to define a moment, time loses its structure. It no longer divides the day into parts that can be anticipated or remembered. Instead, it becomes a presence that exists without form, accompanying each action without defining it. A sound reaches across the space, distant and softened. It does not interrupt the pattern. It settles into it. There is no visible response, no shift in movement. The sound is recognized, but not pursued. It becomes part of the same continuous field that holds everything else, neither separate nor significant. He moves along the path, though the destination does not distinguish itself. Each step follows the one before it with the same measured pace. There is no change in direction, no adjustment that suggests urgency. The path does not lead to something new. It leads back into the same pattern, reinforcing what already exists. You remain at a distance, observing the way time no longer gathers meaning through progression. There is no anticipation of what comes next. No reflection on what has passed. The present holds without extending outward, without drawing attention to its duration. It exists fully, but without definition. And within that undefined space, waiting deepens. Not as a movement toward something, but as a condition that no longer requires time to sustain itself. What the body keeps. The cold is no longer something that arrives. It is already present, settled into surfaces and held within the air, moving through the same spaces without interruption. It does not begin at a certain moment or intensify in a way that can be clearly traced. Instead, it remains consistent, shaping the environment without drawing attention to itself. What changes is not the cold, but the way the body responds to it. Hands adjust first. They remain close to warmth when it is available, though never long enough to rely on it. Fingers move slowly, not from hesitation, but from a narrowing of sensation. The difference between holding and releasing becomes less distinct. Grip is maintained through awareness rather than instinct. Each movement requires a quiet confirmation before it is completed. He pulls the fabric tighter around his wrists, though it does not fully seal the space. The cold finds its way through small openings, not sharply, but with persistence. It does not force entry. It remains until it is allowed to pass inward. The adjustment delays this, but it does not prevent it. The action is repeated throughout the day, not because it resolves the condition, but because it alters it slightly each time. You notice how the body begins to organize itself differently. Movement becomes deliberate, not out of caution alone, but as a way of preserving what remains. Steps shorten. Gestures reduce. Energy is distributed across smaller actions, each one measured without calculation. There is no visible effort to conserve. It happens without instruction, shaped by the condition rather than directed by thought. Inside the structures, the same pattern unfolds in quieter ways. Heat exists in contained areas, held close to its source. It does not expand freely. It is approached, used, and then left behind. Bodies gather near it without forming groups. Each person maintains a distance that allows for access without dependence. The warmth is shared, but not collectively experienced. She sits with her hands extended toward a small source of heat, though she does not bring them too close. There is an understanding that proximity can create a contrast that the body cannot sustain. The warmth is taken in gradually, not enough to restore sensation fully, but enough to delay its loss. When she withdraws her hands, the cold returns without resistance, filling the space that has been briefly altered. You begin to sense how sensation itself becomes uneven. Some areas of the body hold awareness more clearly than others. The face remains alert, responding to the air with each breath. The hands fluctuate, gaining and losing feeling without consistency. The feet remain distant, their condition recognized more through movement than through direct sensation. There is no moment when discomfort becomes unbearable. Instead, it remains constant, held within a range that does not demand immediate change. The body adapts by narrowing its focus, reducing attention to what can be managed. What cannot be altered is absorbed into the background, becoming part of the condition rather than a disruption of it. Outside, movement continues within the same limited range. Figures pass through the cold without reacting to it visibly. Their bodies have already adjusted, carrying the condition as part of their movement. There is no visible resistance, no sign of struggle, only a steady continuation that reflects an internal shift rather than an external change. He pauses briefly, not to rest, but to adjust his stance. The ground beneath him holds unevenly, the snow compressing in ways that require constant correction. Balance is maintained through small shifts that do not draw attention to themselves. Each adjustment supports the next, creating a stability that exists only through continuous effort. You remain at a distance, observing how the body becomes the primary point of reference. Not the environment, not the passage of time, but the internal state that determines what can be done and how it can be done. The cold does not need to be measured. It is known through response. It shapes behavior without announcing itself as a force. And within that shaping, the range of possibility begins to narrow further. Not through restriction, but through the quiet acceptance of what the body will allow. The body does not resist what it cannot change. It adjusts, quietly and without declaration, folding new limits into movements that once required no consideration. What begins as a response becomes a pattern, repeated often enough that it no longer feels like an adjustment at all. The cold remains constant, but the body reorganizes itself around it, shaping each action to fit within what can be sustained. He lowers himself to sit, though the surface beneath him offers no comfort. The contact is brief at first, a test rather than a rest. Weight shifts from one side to the other, never settling fully, never allowing stillness to extend long enough for the cold to deepen its hold. The posture remains active, even in stillness, as if the body continues to move in ways that are too small to be seen. You notice how rest becomes something different. It is no longer a release. It is a redistribution. Muscles do not relax completely. They shift their tension, passing it from one area to another in a slow, continuous exchange. The idea of stopping does not disappear, but it loses its meaning. There is no position that allows the body to be free from the condition. Only positions that delay its effect. Hands return to motion even when there is no immediate task. They press against fabric, adjust small objects, trace surfaces that do not need to be traced. These movements are not purposeful in the usual sense. They serve to maintain circulation, to preserve sensation where it might otherwise fade. The body creates its own tasks when none are required, sustaining itself through repetition. Inside the room, the air remains unchanged. The warmth holds close to its source, never extending far enough to alter the overall condition. Those within it do not seek to increase it beyond what is possible. They adapt to its limits, positioning themselves within reach, then stepping away before reliance can form. The balance is maintained without being discussed. She shifts her position slightly, drawing her hands back into the sleeves of her garment. The motion is practiced, completed without looking. The fabric gathers around her fingers, holding a small pocket of warmth that moves with her. It does not last, but it delays the loss. When her hands emerge again, the process repeats, not as a solution, but as a continuation. You begin to understand how the body becomes both the problem and the solution. It is the source of discomfort, registering the cold, the hunger, the fatigue. And it is the means of managing them, adjusting movement, conserving energy, narrowing focus. There is no separation between what is endured and what endures. The two exist together, shaping each other continuously. Outside, the same condition holds. Figures move with reduced motion, each step calculated through sensation rather than intention. There is no excess in their movement. No gesture that extends beyond what is necessary. The cold does not provoke visible reaction. It is carried within the body, expressed only through the way movement has been altered. A faint sound passes through the air, distant and softened. It does not change the pattern. It does not draw attention beyond the moment of its arrival. The body registers it, but does not respond. The condition remains primary, holding its place regardless of what occurs beyond it. He rises again, though the movement is slower than before. Not from weakness alone, but from the accumulation of adjustments that have already taken place. Each motion follows a sequence that has been refined through repetition. There is no wasted effort, no sudden change in pace. The body moves within the limits it has established, neither pushing beyond them nor retreating from them. You remain where you are, observing how endurance takes shape. Not as strength, not as resistance, but as continuity. The ability to remain within a condition without breaking from it. The body does not overcome what it faces. It learns to exist alongside it, reducing the distance between what is and what can be endured. And within that closeness, something settles further. Not relief, not resolution, but a quiet acceptance that does not require acknowledgement. The weight of repetition. The pattern holds because it repeats, not through intention, but through necessity. Each action follows another that has already been done, not because it must, but because it has been proven to remain within what can be sustained. There is no search for variation, no attempt to change the sequence. The repetition itself becomes the structure that replaces what has been lost. Morning, if it can still be called that, begins in the same way. Light settles across the same surfaces. The same narrow paths are marked again beneath a new layer of snow. Doors open with the same careful motion. The body rises not in response to time, but in response to a rhythm that no longer requires naming. What begins does so without beginning. It continues from where it left off. He steps outside, following the same line as before. There is no need to look for it. The body remembers the placement of each step, adjusting slightly where the surface has changed. The path does not guide him. It confirms what he already knows. Each movement reinforces the one before it, building a continuity that does not rely on awareness to exist. You notice how little is reconsidered. Actions do not require evaluation once they have been established. There is no pause to decide whether something should be done differently. The repetition removes the need for choice. What has worked continues. What has not is no longer attempted. The range of possible actions narrows until it aligns completely with what can be maintained. Inside, the same sequence unfolds. Objects are handled in the same order. Positions are taken and released with minimal variation. Even the small adjustments, tightening fabric, shifting posture, checking surfaces, occur at familiar points within the day. These are not habits formed over time. They are structures that replace the absence of external guidance. She moves through the room without looking for what she needs. Her hands reach where they have reached before, finding objects that have not been moved. The placement of each item supports the pattern, reducing the effort required to locate it. Nothing is arranged for convenience. It is arranged for continuity. You begin to sense how repetition alters perception. What is done repeatedly becomes less visible. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer requires attention. The mind does not linger on what has already been understood. It moves through the sequence without interruption, allowing the body to carry the action forward. Outside, the same figures cross the same spaces. Their movements align without coordination, each following a path that intersects with others without changing direction. There is no exchange beyond what is necessary to avoid contact. No acknowledgement that the pattern is shared. It exists collectively, but it is maintained individually. The air remains unchanged, holding the same stillness that allows sound to settle quickly. A distant noise passes through, familiar in its distance, unremarkable in its presence. It does not disrupt the sequence. It becomes part of it, absorbed into the repetition that defines the day. He pauses at the same point along the path. The reason is not visible, but it is consistent. The body recognizes the moment without needing to explain it. The pause is brief, just enough to adjust, to confirm that the condition remains within what can be endured. Then movement resumes, following the same line as before. You remain at a distance, observing how repetition creates its own stability. Not through change, but through the absence of it. Each action supports the next, forming a structure that holds without needing to be reinforced. The pattern does not weaken over time. It deepens, becoming more complete with each cycle. And within that deepening, something begins to fade. Not the actions themselves, but the awareness that they are being repeated. What repeats long enough begins to lose its outline. Not in form, but in recognition. The same actions continue, the same paths are followed, the same adjustments made at the same points in the day, yet the awareness that they are being repeated grows thinner. Each cycle carries less distinction from the one before it, until the difference between them no longer holds meaning. Inside the room, movement unfolds without interruption. She reaches for the same object, though the moment of reaching does not stand apart from the moments that came before it. The hand extends, closes, and withdraws without pause, not as a sequence of actions, but as a single continuous motion. When it ends, there is no sense that something has been completed, only that something else will follow in the same way. You notice how memory begins to shift. Not lost, but compressed. What has already happened does not remain as a series of distinct moments. It settles into a general awareness, a quiet understanding that something has been done without needing to recall when or how often. The past does not disappear. It becomes less detailed. Outside, the same paths hold their faint impressions. Fresh snow gathers over them, softening their edges, but the underlying shape remains just enough to guide the next step. Each time they are walked, they are reinforced, though the reinforcement is subtle, almost indistinguishable from the accumulation that covers them. The path exists both beneath and within the snow, held in place through use. He moves along it without variation. The pace remains steady, neither faster nor slower than before. There is no adjustment to account for what has changed, because nothing has changed in a way that requires attention. The body follows the same sequence, not out of habit alone, but because the sequence has become the only form that movement can take. You begin to understand how repetition carries its own weight. Not a burden that presses downward, but a presence that fills the space around each action. The more it continues, the more it defines what is possible. Variation does not disappear entirely, but it becomes less likely, less necessary, until it no longer arises. A sound reaches across the open ground, distant and softened. It is similar to others that have come before it, indistinct enough to blend into the pattern. No one stops. No one turns. The sound is received, then absorbed, its presence acknowledged without altering what is already in motion. Inside, the same small adjustments continue. Fabric is tightened. Hands are withdrawn and extended again. Objects are returned to their places with the same care. These actions do not accumulate toward a result. They sustain the condition that allows the pattern to continue. Each one supports the next without advancing beyond it. You remain at a distance, observing how the sequence holds without interruption. There is no point where it pauses long enough to be examined. No moment where it stands still and reveals itself as repetition. It continues through its own momentum, carrying those within it without requiring their attention. He reaches the same place where he paused before. The pause occurs again, not because it is chosen, but because it has been established. The body recognizes the moment without needing to confirm it. The adjustment that follows is small, nearly invisible, yet it completes the sequence in the same way it has before. You begin to sense how this repetition reshapes expectation. There is no anticipation of change, not because change is impossible, but because it has not occurred in a way that alters the pattern. What is expected is not something new, but the continuation of what already exists. The future aligns with the present without deviation. And within that alignment, something settles more completely. Not just the actions, not just the pattern, but the quiet understanding that nothing needs to be different for it to continue. The sound that stays. Sound does not travel far here. It rises, forms, and then settles close to where it began, absorbed by the same stillness that holds everything else in place. The air does not carry it outward with clarity. It softens it, rounds its edges, removes the distance it once could cross. What remains is not silence, but something close to it, sound that has lost its reach. At first, it is difficult to distinguish. A faint report arrives from somewhere beyond the visible range, not sharp enough to locate, not distant enough to ignore. It does not interrupt the pattern already in place. It enters it, settling into the background without altering the movement that continues beneath it. He does not look up. The sound is registered without becoming the center of attention. It holds no immediate instruction. It does not demand a response. The body continues its motion, aligned with the same sequence as before, carrying the sound within it without changing direction. You notice how the sound repeats. Not in a rhythm that can be counted, but in a presence that returns often enough to become familiar. Each time it arrives, it is slightly different, closer or further, softer or more defined, but the difference does not change its meaning. It remains part of the same condition, absorbed into the same continuity. Inside the structures, the effect is quieter, though not absent. The sound reaches the walls, then settles, losing what little force it carried. It does not echo. It does not linger in a way that disturbs the space. It becomes part of the environment, no more significant than the shifting of fabric or the movement of air through a narrow opening. She pauses for a moment, though not in reaction. The pause is brief, aligned with the same rhythm that governs everything else. It does not extend beyond what is already present. When it ends, the movement resumes without adjustment, as though the sound had been expected, even if not consciously anticipated. You begin to sense how sound changes when it cannot move freely. It loses its ability to define distance. It no longer marks where something has happened or how far away it is. Instead, it becomes immediate, contained within the space where it is heard. The outside world does not feel closer. It becomes less distinct. Another report passes through the air. This one carries slightly more weight, enough to be noticed, not enough to alter the pattern. The body registers it through a small shift, shoulders tightening, breath held for a fraction longer than before. Then it passes, and the adjustment releases, returning to what was already in place. No one speaks about it. There is no exchange that defines what has been heard. No attempt to locate it or give it meaning beyond its presence. The sound does not become information. It remains sensation, something experienced rather than interpreted. Outside, figures continue to move along the same narrow paths. Their pace does not change. Their direction does not alter. The sound passes through them without interrupting the sequence. It becomes part of the repetition, another element that does not need to be acknowledged to be understood. You remain at a distance, observing how sound becomes contained. Not silenced, not removed, but reduced to something that no longer travels. It exists where it is heard, then settles, leaving no trace beyond the moment of its presence. And within that containment, something begins to shift again. Not in the sound itself, but in how it is received. What repeats without consequence becomes part of the ground it passes over. The sound no longer arrives as something separate from the day. It folds into it, settling alongside the cold, the stillness, the repetition that already defines each hour. Its presence does not announce change. It confirms continuity, reinforcing the sense that what lies beyond remains active, though it does not reach inward in a way that alters the pattern. He pauses again, though the pause is not new. It occurs at a familiar point, aligned with the same movement that has been repeated before. The sound passes during that pause, not causing it, not extending it. The body holds still for a moment, then continues, as if the timing had been arranged without intention. You notice how the body begins to anticipate without preparing. There is no visible readiness, no adjustment made in advance of the sound. And yet, when it arrives, the response is already present, small, contained, resolved before it can form into something larger. Shoulders tighten slightly. Breath shortens. Then both return to their previous state, as though nothing had occurred. Inside, the same pattern continues without interruption. She lifts her hands from the source of heat, allowing the warmth to fade without resistance. The sound reaches the room, softened further by the walls, reduced to a distant presence that does not carry meaning beyond its arrival. Her movement does not change. The sequence remains intact. The air holds both conditions at once. Cold and sound exist together without interacting. Neither displaces the other. They remain separate, each shaping the environment in its own way, each absorbed into the same quiet continuity that allows them to persist without drawing attention. You begin to understand how familiarity alters perception. What once required acknowledgement no longer does. The sound does not need to be identified, located, or explained. It becomes part of what is already known, integrated into the pattern that governs everything else. Recognition replaces reaction. Another report follows, then another, each one slightly different, none distinct enough to stand apart. The variation exists, but it does not accumulate. Each sound arrives and settles without leaving a trace that influences the next. There is no escalation, no progression, only recurrence, steady and without direction. Outside, movement continues along the same narrow paths. Figures pass through the sound as they pass through the cold, carrying it within their awareness without altering their course. The distance between what is heard and what is done grows wider, not because the sound is less present, but because it holds less influence. You remain at a distance, observing how the environment absorbs what might once have disrupted it. There is no resistance to the sound, no effort to ignore it. It is neither accepted nor rejected. It simply becomes part of the condition that defines the place, existing alongside everything else without distinction. He reaches the same point where the path turns inward. The movement follows without hesitation, not guided by the sound, not altered by it. The sequence continues as it has before, each step reinforcing the pattern that holds the day together. You begin to sense how the outside world recedes without moving. Not through distance, but through relevance. What occurs beyond remains present, but it does not shape what happens within. The connection still exists, but it no longer carries the same weight. And within that quiet separation, the pattern deepens once more. Not disturbed, not broken, but held, more completely than before, within the same unchanging rhythm. Distance that cannot be measured. Distance remains visible, but it no longer behaves the way it once did. The land stretches outward as it always has, uninterrupted, open, carrying the same muted tones that define everything nearby. Trees stand where they stood before. Structures remain placed within the same spaces. Nothing has been removed. Nothing has been added. And yet, what lies beyond the immediate surroundings feels altered, not in form, but in reach. A figure stands at the edge of the town, where the structures begin to thin. The position offers a wider view, though it does not provide greater clarity. The horizon holds steady, softened by the same low light that prevents contrast from forming. There is no visible boundary, no line that separates what can be reached from what cannot. The distance exists fully, but it does not invite movement toward it. He remains there without stepping forward. Not from hesitation, but from recognition. The space ahead does not change in response to attention. It does not reveal anything new. It holds its form without offering direction, without suggesting that something lies within it that must be reached. You notice how the body does not prepare for movement. There is no shift in weight, no adjustment that signals the beginning of a step. The stance remains balanced, contained within the same narrow range that defines all movement here. The distance is acknowledged, but not engaged. Behind him, the town continues within its established pattern. Movement remains close to the structures, following paths that do not extend far beyond them. The repetition holds steady, reinforcing the boundaries that have formed without being marked. What lies within remains active. What lies beyond remains present, but unused. The air between these two spaces carries the same stillness. There is no change in temperature, no shift in sound, no variation that distinguishes one from the other. The difference exists only in how the space is approached. One is inhabited. The other is not. You begin to sense how distance becomes something internal. Not measured by how far something is, but by how far it feels from action. The effort required to move outward does not increase visibly. The ground does not resist more than it did before. And yet, the movement does not occur. The body does not initiate it. A faint sound reaches across the open space, softened as it passes through the air. It does not carry direction. It does not indicate where it began or where it will end. It arrives, then settles, becoming part of the same condition that defines everything else. The sound does not draw the figure forward. It does not alter his stance. He turns slowly, not away from the distance, but back toward what remains close. The movement is not framed as a decision. It follows the same quiet understanding that shapes everything here. What lies within reach continues to define action. What lies beyond remains outside of it. You remain at a distance, observing how the space reorganizes itself without changing its form. Nothing has been reduced. Nothing has been removed. And yet, the world has grown smaller, not through loss, but through the narrowing of what is engaged. The horizon remains where it is. The land continues beyond it. But the connection between here and there begins to dissolve in a way that does not require separation. And within that dissolution, something settles more firmly. Not isolation as a condition imposed, but isolation as a condition lived. Distance no longer invites movement. It remains visible, held in the same quiet expanse beyond the town, but it does not suggest continuation in the way it once might have. The space ahead does not change in response to attention. It does not reveal variation. It holds its form without offering direction, as though it exists apart from the pattern that governs everything within reach. He walks back without looking behind him. The movement is steady, contained within the same range that has already been established. Each step follows a path that does not need to be seen. The ground beneath him offers the same uncertain support, compressing slightly, then settling. There is no difference in the way he moves now compared to before. The distance has not altered his pace. It has only clarified what will not be pursued. You notice how the town receives him without change. There is no transition as he returns. No shift in atmosphere, no alteration in sound or light. The same structures hold their place. The same paths remain faintly marked beneath the snow. Movement continues within the same narrow pattern, unaffected by where he has been. Inside, the same quiet arrangement persists. Objects remain where they were left. The air carries the same limited warmth, held close, never expanding beyond what can be sustained. The body moves through the space without searching, guided by repetition rather than sight. There is no adjustment to account for what lies beyond. Only the continuation of what remains. You begin to understand how distance reshapes expectation. What cannot be reached does not create longing. It becomes neutral, absorbed into the same background as everything else that does not alter the pattern. The mind does not extend toward it. It conserves itself, focusing only on what can be engaged. A figure passes along a nearby path, moving in the opposite direction. There is no exchange, no pause to acknowledge the crossing. The movement continues uninterrupted, each following a sequence that does not intersect beyond the moment of passing. The shared space does not create connection. It maintains alignment. Outside, the open land remains unchanged. The horizon holds steady, neither advancing nor receding. There is no visible barrier, no sign that movement is prevented. And yet, nothing extends toward it. The absence of action defines the space more than any visible limit could. You remain at a distance, observing how the world contracts without closing. The boundaries are not marked. They are lived. Each action reinforces them, not by restricting movement, but by defining where movement occurs. The rest remains present, but unclaimed. He pauses again, though not at the edge this time. The pause occurs within the town, along a path that has been walked repeatedly. The position holds no significance beyond its familiarity. The body recognizes it, adjusts slightly, then continues, completing a sequence that has no need to extend beyond itself. You begin to sense how the idea of elsewhere fades without disappearing. It remains as a concept, not as a direction. The possibility of movement beyond the immediate surroundings still exists, but it does not influence what is done. The present holds its place without requiring expansion. And within that holding, something settles more deeply. Not a boundary, not a limit, but a quiet understanding that the space of action has already been defined. The shape of hunger. Hunger does not arrive as a sudden need. It forms gradually, settling into the body in the same quiet way as the cold. At first, it remains distant, a slight awareness that does not interrupt movement. The body continues as it has before, drawing from what it already holds, adjusting without signaling that anything has changed. There is no urgency in its beginning, only a slow shift that becomes more defined with time. Inside the room, the same limited warmth holds its place. Objects remain arranged within reach, each one part of a pattern that has already been established. She moves toward them without hesitation, her hands finding what is needed without searching. The action is familiar, repeated enough times that it no longer requires attention. The food is simple, measured without being counted. It is handled carefully, not because it is fragile, but because it must remain. Each portion is taken in a way that does not alter what comes after. There is no visible reduction, no immediate sign that anything has been used. The change occurs over time, subtle enough that it does not announce itself in any single moment. You notice how the body responds before the mind does. Movements slow slightly, not enough to disrupt the pattern, but enough to conserve what is being used. Gestures become smaller. The space between actions lengthens without intention. The body does not demand more. It adjusts to having less. He sits with the same posture as before, though something within it has shifted. The balance remains, the quiet readiness held in place, but the energy that supports it feels thinner, distributed more carefully across each movement. There is no visible strain, only a quiet reduction that shapes how the body holds itself. You begin to sense how hunger changes perception, not through discomfort alone, but through focus. Attention narrows, not to a point, but to a range that excludes what is unnecessary. The surroundings remain visible, but they do not draw the same level of awareness. The body directs attention inward, toward what must be maintained. Outside, the same pattern of movement continues. Figures cross the same paths, their pace unchanged, their direction steady. There is no visible sign that anything has been reduced. The repetition holds, reinforcing the appearance of continuity even as something beneath it shifts. The air carries no scent of food beyond the immediate space. What exists remains contained, not spreading outward, not drawing others toward it. The absence is not noticed as a lack. It becomes part of the condition, held alongside everything else that does not change. You notice how the act of eating does not interrupt the day. It does not create a moment of pause distinct from the rest. It fits into the same pattern, performed with the same quiet consistency as every other action. There is no beginning to it, no clear end, only a continuation. He lifts what remains, taking it without variation. The movement is steady, aligned with the same rhythm that defines everything else. There is no adjustment to account for less. The body accepts what is given, shaping itself around it without resistance. You remain at a distance, observing how hunger settles into the pattern. Not as a disruption. Not as a force that demands change, but as something that reshapes the same actions from within, altering them without altering their form. And within that quiet shift, something begins to narrow further. Not space, not time, but the range of what the body can sustain. Hunger does not intensify in a way that demands attention. It settles deeper, becoming less distinct even as it becomes more present. What begins as awareness shifts into something quieter, held within the body without needing to be acknowledged. The sensation does not disappear. It changes its form, blending into the same continuity that carries everything else forward. She lowers her hands after eating, though the movement does not signal completion. There is no clear end to the action. The space between one moment and the next remains unchanged. What has been taken does not stand apart from what remains. The difference exists, but it is not marked. It is absorbed into the same pattern that governs the day. You notice how energy redistributes rather than diminishes. The body does not collapse or withdraw. It adjusts, directing what remains toward what is necessary. Movements continue, but they hold less extension. Each action completes itself within a smaller range, avoiding anything that would require more than what can be sustained. Inside the room, the arrangement holds steady. Objects are returned to their places with the same care as before. Nothing is left out. Nothing is added. The pattern remains intact, not because it resists change, but because change does not arise within it. The sequence continues without interruption. He remains seated, though the posture has shifted slightly. The balance is still present, but it is maintained with less reserve. The body holds itself within the same structure, though the effort required to do so has increased without becoming visible. There is no sign of strain. Only a quiet adjustment that repeats each time the position is taken. You begin to sense how hunger alters time in a different way. Not by removing its structure, but by narrowing its reach. The day does not feel longer or shorter. It feels contained within what the body can sustain. What lies beyond that range becomes less accessible, not through distance, but through capacity. Outside, the same movements continue along the same paths. There is no visible change in pace, no sign that anything has been reduced. The repetition conceals the shift, allowing the pattern to hold its form even as it is altered from within. Each step follows the last, completing a sequence that no longer extends as far as it once did. A faint sound passes through the air, distant and softened. It does not interrupt. It does not draw attention beyond its arrival. The body registers it without response, maintaining the same alignment that has been established. The sound becomes part of the background, indistinguishable from the rest. You notice how the absence of fullness becomes familiar, not accepted in a way that is acknowledged, but integrated into the condition. The body no longer expects to feel complete. It adjusts to remaining within a state that does not resolve. The expectation fades, leaving only continuation. She rises again, though the movement is slower than before. Not from hesitation, but from the quiet calculation that now shapes every action. The body moves within its limits, completing the motion without exceeding them. There is no attempt to extend beyond what is possible. Only the repetition of what remains. You remain at a distance, observing how hunger becomes part of the pattern. Not separate from it. Not something that disrupts it. but something that defines its boundaries more clearly with each passing moment. And within those boundaries, something settles further still. Not the absence of hunger, but the absence of expectation that it will be otherwise. The quiet between signals. There are moments when nothing arrives. No sound crossing the distance. No movement that alters the pattern. No change in light or air that suggests something beyond what is already present. These moments do not stand out at first. They pass within the same continuity as everything else, unnoticed, unmarked. The space holds steady. Outside, the paths remain faint beneath the snow, their outlines suggested rather than defined. Figures move along them at intervals, each following the same contained range, each action completing itself without extending beyond what is necessary. The repetition continues without interruption, reinforcing the pattern that has already taken shape. Inside, the same arrangement persists. Objects remain in their places, held within the quiet order that does not require adjustment. The air carries its limited warmth, contained near its source, never reaching far enough to alter the room as a whole. Movement occurs within this space without variation, guided by familiarity rather than intention. You notice how attention begins to shift toward absence, not as something missing, but as something present in its own way. The moments between sounds grow more noticeable, not because they are longer, but because they hold without interruption. The expectation of what might arrive does not form. The absence becomes its own condition. He pauses along the path, though there is no sound to prompt it. The pause aligns with the same pattern as before, occurring at a familiar point, held for the same brief duration. The body maintains its rhythm, not in response to something external, but through repetition alone. When movement resumes, it follows the same sequence without adjustment. You begin to sense how silence changes when it is not broken. It does not feel empty. It feels complete, holding everything within it without needing to be filled. The absence of sound does not create tension. It removes the need for response. What remains is a continuity that does not depend on interruption to define itself. A door opens briefly, then closes again. The sound it produces is small, contained, absorbed quickly into the surrounding stillness. It does not travel. It does not carry beyond the immediate space. Once it settles, there is no trace that it occurred. The pattern continues as though it had always been uninterrupted. You notice how the body no longer prepares for what might come. There is no visible readiness, no adjustment made in anticipation. The absence of signals does not create uncertainty. It creates stability. What is not present does not need to be accounted for. The body moves within what is known, not within what might occur. Outside, the air remains unchanged. No sound passes through it. No movement alters its stillness. The land holds its form without variation, extending outward in the same muted tones, offering no distinction between one moment and the next. You remain at a distance, observing how the quiet deepens. Not through accumulation, but through continuity. Each moment holds without interruption, reinforcing the sense that nothing beyond the immediate pattern requires attention. The world does not narrow further. It holds steady within the limits already established. And within that steady quiet, something begins to settle more completely. Not relief, not expectation, but a condition where nothing needs to arrive for the pattern to continue. When nothing arrives, the body no longer listens for it. Attention settles into what is already present, not reaching outward, not extending beyond the immediate range of sensation. The absence of sound does not create a space that needs to be filled. It becomes the condition itself, holding steady without expectation of interruption. Inside, the same movements continue without variation. She adjusts the fabric around her hands, not because it has shifted, but because the motion maintains what must be preserved. The action is small, repeated, aligned with the same sequence that has already been established. When it ends, there is no pause to consider it. The next movement follows without separation. You notice how the body no longer distinguishes between moments. There is no sense of before or after within the quiet. Each action exists fully, but without connection to what preceded it or what will follow. The sequence continues, but it does not form a chain that can be traced. It remains contained within itself. Outside, the paths remain faint, their outlines reinforced through use rather than visibility. Figures pass along them at intervals, each movement aligned with the same pattern. There is no coordination between them, no shared acknowledgement of the quiet that holds the space. The absence of sound does not draw them together. It allows them to continue independently. A slight shift in the air passes through, though it carries no distinct change. It moves across surfaces without altering them, then settles again into stillness. The movement is noticed only in passing, not held long enough to become significant. It does not interrupt the pattern. It becomes part of it. You begin to understand how silence reshapes awareness. What is not present no longer needs to be considered. The body does not search for signals that may or may not arrive. It moves within what is certain, conserving attention in the same way it conserves energy. The absence becomes a form of stability. He stands near the edge of a structure, though he does not look outward. The position does not offer a view that requires observation. The space beyond remains unchanged, holding the same quiet continuity as before. His posture remains steady, contained within the same limits that define all movement here. You notice how stillness extends beyond the environment. It settles into the body, into the rhythm of movement, into the space between actions. There is no point where it begins or ends. It exists throughout, unbroken, holding everything within it. Inside, the same arrangement persists. Objects remain in place. The air holds its limited warmth. Movement continues without variation. The quiet does not alter these conditions. It reinforces them, allowing the pattern to continue without interruption. You remain at a distance, observing how the absence of signals becomes complete. Not because nothing exists beyond the immediate space, but because what exists does not reach inward in a way that changes what is already present. And within that completeness, something settles fully. Not the end of waiting, but the absence of anything that would define it differently. When nothing changes. Nothing changes, and yet everything continues. The same light settles across the same surfaces, diffused through the low sky without casting a shadow strong enough to define shape. Snow rests where it has already gathered, adding to itself without altering what lies beneath. The paths remain faint, their outlines reinforced through use, then softened again by what falls quietly over them. Inside, the arrangement holds without adjustment. Objects remain in their places, not fixed, but unchanged through lack of necessity. The air carries its limited warmth, held close, never extending far enough to alter the room as a whole. Movement continues within this space, guided by repetition rather than decision. She sits as she has before, her posture balanced within the same narrow range. There is no visible shift in how she holds herself, no sign that time has passed beyond the continuation of the pattern. Hands remain close, adjusting fabric in small, familiar motions. Each movement completes itself without drawing attention to its repetition. You notice how the absence of change becomes its own condition. Not a pause, not a delay, but a steady state that holds without requiring variation. What remains the same does not lose meaning. It becomes the meaning, shaping the way everything is experienced. Outside, figures move along the same paths. Their pace remains steady, their direction unchanged. Each movement follows a sequence that has already been established, reinforcing the pattern that defines the day. There is no extension beyond it, no attempt to alter its course. A faint sound passes through the air, distant and softened. It does not interrupt. It does not distinguish itself from what has come before. The body registers it without response, maintaining the same alignment that has already been formed. You begin to sense how the pattern no longer depends on what occurs within it. It sustains itself, carried forward by repetition alone. The actions do not lead to something beyond themselves. They exist as continuation, not progression. He steps along the path, though the destination does not define the movement. Each step follows the one before it, not advancing toward change, but reinforcing what is already present. The ground shifts slightly beneath him, then settles again, offering the same uncertain support as before. You remain at a distance, observing how continuity replaces variation. The day does not unfold. It holds. And within that holding, something begins to settle beyond the pattern itself. Not in the actions, not in the environment, but in the quiet understanding that nothing needs to change for it to continue. When nothing changes, the pattern no longer requires awareness. It continues without being observed from within, carried forward by movements that no longer need to be noticed to be sustained. The body follows the same sequence, not out of habit alone, but because the sequence has become the only form that remains. What is done does not feel repeated. It feels continuous. Inside, the room holds its quiet arrangement. She moves through it without looking for what she needs, her hands finding their place without searching. Each object remains where it was left, supporting the same sequence that has already been established. The air carries its limited warmth, contained and unchanged, never extending beyond its small range. You notice how the distinction between one moment and the next has thinned. There is no clear separation, no sense that something has ended and something else has begun. The day does not divide itself. It remains whole, extended, without edges. What continues does so without marking its passage. Outside, the same figures move along the same paths. Their pace does not alter. Their direction remains within the same narrow range. Each step reinforces the pattern without extending beyond it. There is no visible effort to maintain this continuity. It holds on its own. A sound reaches across the space, distant and softened. It does not stand apart from what has come before. It settles into the same quiet background, neither distinct nor absent. The body receives it without response, maintaining the same alignment that has already been formed. You begin to understand how stability emerges from repetition. Not through change, not through adjustment, but through the absence of variation. The pattern does not weaken over time. It becomes more complete, more contained, less dependent on anything beyond itself. He pauses along the path, though the pause no longer carries distinction. It occurs as part of the sequence, not as a break within it. The body holds still for a moment, then continues, completing the same cycle without drawing attention to it. The pause does not mark anything. It belongs to the pattern. You notice how expectation has faded. There is no anticipation of something different. No sense that the pattern will shift. What exists holds its place without requiring change to define it. The future does not extend beyond the present. It aligns with it. Inside, the same small adjustments continue. Fabric is tightened. Hands are withdrawn and extended again. Objects are returned to their places. These actions do not accumulate toward a result. They sustain the condition that allows the pattern to continue. You remain at a distance, observing how the absence of change becomes complete. Not because nothing exists beyond it, but because what exists no longer depends on variation to be understood. And within that completeness, something settles into its final form. Not a resolution, not an ending, but a state where continuation no longer points beyond itself. When the pattern holds everything. When the pattern holds everything, nothing remains outside of it. What once existed beyond the immediate range of action, the roads, the distance, the sounds that hinted at something further, no longer carries weight. Not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer enters the sequence that defines the day. The pattern has expanded inward, filling the space that once allowed for variation. Inside, the room remains unchanged in its arrangement. Objects hold their positions without adjustment. The air carries the same contained warmth, neither growing nor fading in a way that alters the space. Movement continues within it, guided by the same quiet sequence that has already been established. There is no need to reinforce it. It holds on its own. She reaches for the same object without looking. The motion completes itself within a single, continuous line, not divided into parts that require attention. When it ends, there is no pause to mark completion. The next movement follows without separation, carried forward by the same rhythm that defines everything else. You notice how the body no longer considers alternatives. There is no sense that something could be done differently. The sequence does not present options. It presents continuation. Each action arises from the one before it, forming a closed structure that does not extend outward. Outside, the same paths remain faint beneath the snow. Figures move along them at intervals, each following the same narrow range. There is no deviation, no extension beyond what has already been defined. The repetition holds, reinforcing itself without effort. A distant sound passes through the air, softened and contained. It does not enter the pattern. It remains at its edge, acknowledged without being integrated. The body registers it, but it does not alter movement. The sequence continues unchanged. You begin to sense how the pattern becomes complete. Not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of containing everything that is required to sustain itself. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. What exists holds without reference to what lies beyond it. He moves along the path, though the movement no longer carries direction. Each step follows the last, not leading toward something, but maintaining what is already present. The ground shifts beneath him in the same quiet way, offering the same uncertain support. There is no adjustment to account for difference. The pattern absorbs it. You notice how awareness narrows without effort, not as a loss, but as a refinement. The body attends only to what is necessary to continue. What lies outside that range fades without resistance, not because it is forgotten, but because it is no longer required. Inside, the same small adjustments continue. Hands move across fabric. Objects are lifted and returned. Positions are taken and released. These actions do not accumulate toward a result. They sustain the pattern that allows everything else to remain unchanged. You remain at a distance, observing how the pattern holds without interruption. There is no moment where it breaks. No point where it reveals something beyond itself. It continues, complete within its own boundaries. And within that completeness, something begins to settle in a different way. Not within the pattern, but beneath it. When the pattern holds everything. Beneath what continues, something no longer follows. It does not interrupt the pattern. It does not alter the sequence that holds the day together. The same movements repeat, the same paths are crossed, the same small adjustments made at the same moments. And yet, beneath that continuity, a quiet separation begins to form, subtle, without signal, existing alongside what persists without joining it. He pauses, though the pause is no longer part of the sequence. It appears similar to those that have come before, held at a familiar point, contained within the same brief duration. But it does not align in the same way. The body remains still, not extending the pause, not reducing it, but holding it without the quiet certainty that once guided it. You notice how the movement that follows is almost unchanged. The step continues. The path remains the same. The pattern resumes without visible disruption. And yet, the connection between one action and the next has thinned. The sequence holds, but it no longer carries the same internal cohesion. Inside, the room remains arranged as it has been. Objects hold their places. The air carries its limited warmth. Movement continues within the same narrow range. She reaches, adjusts, returns, each action completing itself without interruption. The pattern remains intact, fully visible, fully sustained. But something within it has grown quieter. Not the movement, not the repetition, but the alignment that once connected them. You begin to sense how continuity can exist without integration. The actions persist, but they no longer reinforce one another in the same way. Each moment completes itself, yet it does not fully carry forward into the next. The sequence continues, but it feels less bound, less contained within itself. A distant sound passes through the air, softened as before. It reaches the edge of perception, settles, and fades. The body registers it without response. The pattern does not absorb it. It remains outside, neither entering nor disrupting what continues within. He moves again, though the movement feels slightly altered. Not in direction, not in pace, but in its relation to what surrounds it. The step completes, but it does not connect as fully to the one that follows. The pattern continues, yet the sense of being carried by it has diminished. You notice how awareness begins to return in fragments. Not fully, not with clarity, but enough to distinguish one moment from another in a way that had previously faded. The repetition remains, but it is seen again, not as something that must be followed, but as something that is occurring. Inside, the same actions continue. Hands move across fabric. Objects are lifted and returned. Positions are taken and released. The pattern holds, visible and unchanged. And yet, within it, a slight distance has formed between what is done and what is experienced. You remain at a distance, observing how the pattern persists without holding everything. It continues as before, complete in form, sustained in repetition. But beneath it, something has begun to separate, not enough to break it, not enough to alter it, but enough to exist alongside it without being contained. And within that separation, something begins to take shape. Not a change in the environment, not a shift in the pattern, but the quiet possibility that the pattern is no longer the only thing that remains. When waiting no longer points forward. Waiting continues, but it no longer reaches ahead. It remains present in every action, in every pause, in the quiet continuity that holds the day together. And yet, it no longer carries direction. It does not extend toward an outcome. It does not gather itself around the idea that something will arrive. It exists fully, but without pointing beyond itself. Outside, the same paths remain faint beneath the snow. Figures move along them as before, their pace unchanged, their direction contained within the same narrow range. Each step follows the one before it, not leading toward something, but maintaining what is already present. The repetition holds, steady and without variation. He walks along the path without looking outward. The movement does not seek connection with what lies beyond. It remains within the same sequence, guided by familiarity rather than intention. The ground shifts slightly beneath him, then settles, offering the same uncertain support as before. You notice how the idea of arrival has faded. Not removed, not forgotten, but no longer active within the pattern. There is no anticipation of what might come next. No sense that the sequence will lead to something beyond itself. The future does not extend outward. It remains contained within the present. Inside, the same arrangement persists. Objects remain in place. The air carries its limited warmth. Movement continues within the same quiet rhythm. She reaches, adjusts, returns, each action completing itself without reference to what follows. You begin to sense how waiting changes when it no longer expects. It does not disappear. It deepens. Without direction, it becomes a condition that holds on its own, not sustained by hope or uncertainty, but by continuity alone. The absence of expectation does not create emptiness. It creates stillness. A faint sound passes through the air, distant and softened. It does not interrupt. It does not suggest change. The body registers it without response, maintaining the same alignment that has already been formed. The sound does not carry meaning beyond its presence. You notice how movement continues without anticipation. Each action arises from the one before it, not from what might come next. The sequence does not extend beyond itself. It holds steady, complete within its own boundaries. He pauses again, though the pause no longer carries intention. It occurs as part of the pattern, not as a moment of reflection or preparation. The body holds still briefly, then continues, completing the same cycle without drawing attention to it. You remain at a distance, observing how waiting settles into its final form. Not as a passage toward something, not as a space between events, but as a condition that exists without requiring anything beyond itself. And within that condition, something begins to shift once more. Not in what is done, not in what is seen, but in the quiet understanding of what waiting has become. When waiting no longer points forward, it begins to turn inward. Not as reflection, not as thought, but as a quiet reorientation of attention. What once extended outward, toward distance, toward arrival, toward something not yet present, now settles within the same narrow space that holds everything else. The condition remains, but its direction dissolves. Inside, the room continues as it has before. She moves through it without searching, her hands finding what they need without hesitation. Objects remain in place. The air carries its limited warmth. Each action completes itself within the same quiet sequence, unchanged in form, unchanged in pace. You notice how the absence of expectation alters movement. There is no hesitation before an action begins, no pause to consider what might follow. The body moves within what is known, guided by the same rhythm that has already been established. The sequence continues, but it no longer reaches beyond itself. Outside, the same paths hold their faint impressions. Figures move along them at intervals, each step aligned with the same contained range. There is no extension, no deviation. The repetition holds steady, reinforcing the boundaries that have formed without being marked. A distant sound passes through the air, softened as before. It does not carry meaning beyond its presence. It arrives, then settles, becoming part of the same quiet continuity. The body registers it without response, maintaining the same alignment that defines every movement. You begin to understand how waiting changes when it is no longer tied to time. It does not measure what has passed or what may come. It exists within the present, sustained by repetition rather than anticipation. The absence of direction does not weaken it. It completes it. He moves along the path, though the movement no longer suggests continuation. Each step follows the one before it, not leading toward something, but maintaining what is already present. The ground shifts slightly beneath him, then settles, offering the same uncertain support. You notice how awareness settles into a different state. Not expanded, not reduced, but contained. The body attends only to what is necessary to continue. What lies beyond that range remains present, but it does not influence what is done. Inside, the same small adjustments continue. Fabric is tightened. Hands are withdrawn and extended again. Objects are returned to their places. These actions do not accumulate toward a result. They sustain the condition that allows everything else to remain unchanged. You remain at a distance, observing how waiting becomes complete. Not because it leads somewhere. Not because it ends. But because it no longer requires anything beyond itself to exist. And within that completeness, something settles into quiet clarity. Not a resolution. Not a change. But the recognition that what has been sustained no longer points beyond the moment in which it exists. Epilogue. After the snow holds. The snow remains after everything has settled into itself. It lies across the same ground, covering the same paths, resting against the same structures that have held their place without change. There is no moment that marks when the waiting altered, or when the pattern released what it had contained. The surface appears as it did before, softened, even, uninterrupted. And yet, something beneath it no longer holds in the same way. The roads are still present, though their outlines have shifted. Where movement once repeated, the surface has begun to level. Impressions fade more quickly, no longer reinforced by the same steady passage. The ground does not resist. It accepts what settles into it, then returns to stillness without preserving the trace for long. You notice how the space feels wider again, though nothing has moved. The horizon remains where it was, stretching outward in muted tones, unchanged in form. But the distance carries a different weight now, not because it has grown closer, but because it no longer feels contained within the same narrowing. The sense of inward holding has eased, though it leaves no clear boundary where it ended. Inside the structures, the same objects remain in place. They do not rearrange themselves. They do not signal that something has passed. The air carries the same quiet presence, though the way it settles feels less confined. The warmth, when it appears, does not hold in quite the same way. It extends slightly further, not enough to define a change, but enough to suggest that something has shifted beyond what can be seen. The bodies that move within these spaces carry their own memory of what has been held. Not in thought, not in reflection, but in the way they adjust without being asked. Hands still move with care. Steps still fall within a measured range. The pattern has not disappeared. It lingers, quieter now, less complete, but still present in the smallest movements. You remain at a distance, observing how nothing declares what has changed. There is no signal that waiting has ended. No moment that separates what was from what is now. The continuation simply takes on a different shape, one that does not hold as tightly, one that allows for a slight expansion without defining it. The quiet remains, though it carries less weight. It no longer settles in the same way, no longer absorbs everything into itself. It opens slightly, allowing space to exist between what is heard and what is not. The difference is small, almost unnoticeable, yet it holds. And within that space, something becomes clear. Not through explanation, not through resolution, but through the absence of what once defined every moment. Waiting has not ended. It has changed its form. And what remains is not the memory of what was endured, but the quiet shape it has left behind, held in movement, in stillness, in the way the world continues without needing to name what has passed. The snow does not remember, but it holds, for a while, the outline of where everything once remained. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.